Greetings folks and welcome to 81632-bit. Today we are going to be looking at the FM Towns Marty. Now, what was the FM Towns Marty, I hear you ask? Well, the FM Towns Marty was a consoleized version of Fujitsu's FM Towns range of PC-like computers. And when I say PC-like, I mean they were basically IBM PCs, albeit with their own separate operating system. Now, the FM Towns Marty was based on a AMD 386SX processor running at 16 MHz. Now, this doesn't sound like a lot, but compared to most of the consoles available at the time in the early 1990s, which were using variants on the Motorola 68000 or even the venerable MOS 6502, this was a significant jump up. Now, this is a 32-bit CPU, which is operating, however, on a 16-bit data bus, so is somewhat crippled. The system shipped with 2 megabytes of RAM, 640k of video RAM, which was split into 512k of straight VRAM and 128k of sprite RAM. This ran on a custom Fujitsu graphics chip, which operated in a number of different resolutions ranging from 256 by 240 all the way up to the high resolution 720 by 480. It had a number of virtual resolutions which could be accessed using a bitmap mode all the way up to 1024 by 512, and the colour palette was either 4096, 32768 or a full 16.7 million colours available. Now on screen you could either show 16256 or 32768. Now, you could have up to 1024 sprites being displayed at a size of 16 by 16 pixels, which was pretty impressive. Sound was provided by a Yamaha YM26126 6-channel FM synthesis chip and a Ricoh RF5C68 8-channel PCM sampler, which used a 19.6 kHz sampling rate. It could also play back CD digital audio. For its storage, the machine used a single-speed CD-ROM drive and an internal 3.5-inch floppy disk drive. Now, the disks used the PC98 format, which was approximately 1.2 megabytes, and it also had a PCMCIA Type 1 slot which could be used for expansions. The joypads were simple, 2-button 4-way D-pads using a standard Atari type connector. There was later released a 6-button pad for a version of Street Fighter 2 that was released for the system. There was also a keyboard port. Now, what's interesting to note here is these are basically the specifications of a fairly nicely spec'd early 90s 386 PC, but the FM Towns at the time did not run on the standard DOS and Windows. It used its own custom DOS-based system, Towns OS, hence the complete lack of hard drive, because this OS ran from the games media. So you could stick a disc in or stick a CD in and the game would boot straight to that CD. If not, you would get the attract sequence that you can see above. Now, the FM Towns was not massively successful, even in Japan. It's believed that the system sold somewhere in the region of 50,000 units at the price of 98,000 yen, which was roughly the equivalent to about $700 at the time. So it's quite a pricey system, especially when you compared it to what were ultimately its competitors in 1993, the Mega Drive, the SNES, the PC Engine. Even with the CD add-ons for the PC Engine and the Mega CD for the Mega Drive, this made the FM Towns expensive, and it was up against other similar high-spec computery type systems such as the SharpX 68000, Fujitsu's own FM Towns desktop systems, and the PC98, plus the growing market for Windows and DOS-based PCs. Now, the FM Towns Marty can lay claim to technically being the first 32-bit console, even though it's a 32-bit processor on a 16-bit bus, because it does predate the CD32, although there will be people that will argue that this is nonsense. Anyway, the FM Towns, whilst not being a huge success, did see quite a few games released for it in Japan. Now, there were some quite notable titles, such as a version of Street Fighter 2, the most arcade-perfect version of Namco's Splatterhouse, and some others. So let's just take a quick look at some games, starting with Namco's Splatterhouse. Now, Namco's Splatterhouse had already been converted at this time to NEC's PC Engine. However, to get the game onto a HuCard, a number of cutbacks were made to the graphical fidelity, the sound, and censorship was made to the gore. The mask was changed, the gore was toned down. However, here, on the FM Towns Marty, you had an arcade-perfect rendition of the game. It looks, sounds, and plays exactly like its arcade version, which means it is, as you can see, super gruesome. It's very smooth. It plays really well. You know, it sounds incredible. This is the best version of the game. For those who aren't familiar with Splatterhouse, the story is quite simple. You play Rick, a college student who finds himself out in the woods with his girlfriend one day when a storm arises, and they run and take shelter in an old mansion, only for all the lights to go out, and for the last thing Rick knows about his girlfriend Jennifer to be a scream as she is dragged off. Rick is brought back from near death by the Terror Mask, which promises him the power to go and save Jennifer as long as he wears him and accepts the power that he's given. So off Rick goes on an intensely gruesome and violent beat 'em up. Now, being an arcade conversion, this game is hard, like really hard, but it's also incredibly good fun, and would go on to spawn 2 sequels for Sega's Mega Drive and eventually a reboot on the Xbox 360 and PS3, but we won't talk about that today. This is a brilliant example of how the extra power of the AMD 386SX CPU and the 2 megs of RAM and the 640k video RAM were leveraged to basically produce an arcade perfect conversion, something which prior to this really had only been seen on the Sharp X68000 console, but here we were with Splatterhouse on the FM Towns Marty, and it looks superb. So the next game we're going to take a look at is a conversion of one of Sega's incredible sprite scaling games in Galaxy Force 2. Now, Galaxy Force and Galaxy Force 2 are incredibly impressive sprite scaling games. You know, you look at them in the arcade and you're like blown away. Now, there were various other home conversions of this game. There's a Master System version of Galaxy Force, and I think there's a Mega Drive version of Galaxy Force or Galaxy Force 2. And they look pretty good, but they do not compete with this at all. I mean, as you can see here, you've got a nicely done introductory sequence here after the game boots up, with some nicely hand-drawn graphics being shown on the screen. No FMV, but still looks good. Obviously, it's giving you the background as to what's going on, albeit all in Japanese. So, you know, if you understand Japanese, you'll know what's going on. And, you know, this leads you into the game, and the presentation is top-notch. You know, this is the kind of presentation that at the time you weren't really getting on other game shows. There was a few PC Engine CD-ROM games, and some Mega CD games had, you know, extensive introductions, but nothing that really matched this, I think, in terms of the visual fidelity. This looks crisp. You know, you might have got this if you had a PC with a CD-ROM on a handful of titles, but not many. But here on the Marty, you're getting, you know, top-notch presentation, and, you know, there's your high score table, because every game has to have high score table options, but we don't need to mess about with that. let's get into the game. And as you can see, you can select your level and you can play through them in pretty much any sequence that you wish. But you know, right now we're going to do it simple. CNA level 1. Best way to do it. And here we go. And as you can see, it looks pretty darn spiffy already. You know, this is when people talk about arcade quality in the home, this is what they meant. This game looks superb. The scaling graphics are outstanding. They look beautiful, crisp, clean. You can tell what they're supposed to be. The soundtrack is incredible while you're playing. It really does take advantage of being on a CD to really give some depth to the soundtrack. You know, this is a game that at the time, so 1992-93, even with the Mega CD, with games like Soulstar, you weren't quite seeing anything that matched up to the standard of this. You know, you had to wait until, say, you know, maybe some 3DO titles gave a similar effect, and then PlayStation and Saturn. But other than that, this was as good as it got. You know, fast, smooth, as close to the arcade as you were ever going to get on a home system at the time. It's superb. But on to the next game. Now, next up, we have another great bit of Sega arcade goodness here with the conversion of Turbo Outrun, the sequel to the legendary Outrun. Now, obviously, it isn't Outrun, which is an absolute bona fide classic. However, Turbo Outrun, in and of itself, is a highly enjoyable game to play. Now, yes, you don't have the crazy multiple routes like you had in the original, but you still have a pretty darn good arcade racer. And again, this was as close as you were probably getting at the time to having the arcade in your home. You know, look at it. The graphics are great. They're quite smooth. They're big, they're colourful, the scaling is handled beautifully. You've got the undulations in the road. You know, this is what you wanted. When somebody said an arcade in your home, this is what you imagined you were getting. You know, you could have a Mega Drive, and there were some great versions of Mega Drive games. There's a great version of this on the Mega Drive, but it doesn't quite compare. You know, this is the hardware behind this was pushing it so hard, you know, using that AMD 386 CPU, you were getting so much more performance than the Motorola CPUs could, unless you were on a really high-end system like the X68000. And this is just a great game. Like I said, it looks brilliant. The scaling, the colours, the sound as well. You know, again, it takes advantage of the CD format to really give you some great sound effects and music tracks. And it plays really well. It's nice and tight. This is an absolutely superb game. And again, if you managed to import a Marty at the time and you had this, you know, your friends would be envious of you. It really is a superb arcade conversion. But there's one more game I want to show, and it's something that a lot of Japanese systems were famous for in terms of its genre, because it's a genre of game that the Japanese just absolutely adore. So I couldn't cover an obscure Japanese system without covering at least one shoot 'em up, and this is one of the best. This is Truxton 2. It is a superb shooter. It's everything you could pretty much want in a vertical shooter of the time. We're not talking full on, you know, bullet hell like came later on in the 90s and early 2000s. This is much more traditional. It's in Tate mode and it's superb. Truxton 2 is a great game, and this looks beautiful. Again, this is beautiful pixel art being thrown around smoothly. No slow down, no flicker. This is how you wanted these games to play. This is how they played in your head when you were sat there with your Mega Drive playing Truxton on the Mega Drive or any other sort of vertical shooters you could think of. You know, this is how you pictured it in your mind. This is what was in your head. This is how you were seeing it, even if it wasn't quite up to this, even if the game slowed down, even if there were sprite flickering going on. This is what your mind was saying. But it was only when you sat down with a machine like the FM Towns Marty or the X68000 that you got this level of wow. And it's superb. It plays beautifully. It looks beautiful. The soundtrack is outstanding. Again, being a CD-based system, it really can take advantage of all that extra storage for the audio. You know, this is a shoot 'em up fan's dream. This is what you wanted. Pretty much what I would call arcade perfect. There's no ifs, ands or buts. This is how these games were designed and meant to be played. I'm not a huge shoot 'em up fan, but even I can look at this and go, God damn it, this is amazing. But anyway, that's just a few games for the FM Towns Marty that show off what it could do. Now, while the FM Towns Marty can claim to be the world's first 32-bit console, obviously, when you compare it to what came later in the 32-bit race, even machines like the 3DO, the Jaguar, and the PlayStation, the Saturn, it's clear where the system's strengths lay. It was a 2D graphics powerhouse. Yes, there were games that used 3D graphics, which you can now see on screen, but they were basically the same as what a 386 powered IBM PC was producing in the early 90s. It was 3D, but it was nowhere near what we were going to be seeing in the home sort of 12, 18 months later, which is unfortunate. But that is the FM Towns Marty, an incredible little machine which never made it out of Japan, wasn't hugely successful in Japan, but for those of us of a certain vintage who remember reading magazines like Mean Machines and CVG back in the day, Edge, this was the kind of console that popped up in those on their import pages, showing off just how much more advanced the Japanese market appeared to be compared to what we were getting in the West. Now, if any of you have ever played on an actual FM Towns, you know, let me know in the comments below. Let me know what you think. Tell me what games you think are worth playing on the FM Towns Marty. You know, if you've liked this video, do hit the like button. Do subscribe to the video if you want to listen to more of my witterings on about consoles. Hype the video and share the video. It all helps with getting this channel out there and in front of as many sets of eyes as possible. If you want to really help the channel, you can donate. You can donate via my Ko-fi link down below. There are also YouTube memberships and Patreon memberships available down below. You'll see the names of my YouTube and Patreon members on screen now at the moment. As always, much love to you guys. And that's it for this video. That was the FM Towns Marty. I was Rob from 81632-bit Retro, and I hope you enjoyed yourself. See you on the next one.